Hi everyone. Today's webinar is the 5 critical practices to make Agile work for Angular, React, and Backbone projects. And a few people have asked me why it's such a specific title, and that's because there are very unique differences when you run an Agile project with single-page applications, because you're working across boundaries across computer systems, because your front-end application is actually running on a different computer because so much of your code is being built to run in the browser. There's not a real logical tie to the server, even though it might feel like that. So for today's webinar, it's going to be myself, Nick Van Werdenberg, the CEO of Rangle.io, and David Van Rees, our Scrum lead, and we're going to walk you through what we've learned in delivering over 50 Agile single-page application projects at Rangle in the last couple of years. And for the agenda, we're going to talk about the challenge of single-page apps in an Agile environment, why we need to fix this, and how to fix this and work through it. Story writing, API contracts, continuous delivery, Agile testing, and how you need to adjust as needed, and then talk through some conclusions. And we're going to hop back and forth between me and Dave, as you can see through the agenda. So the first key point is, what's the challenge? And we're doing Agile for single-page apps, and interesting things pop up. And just for a simple definition of Agile, Agile is working from releasable software and everything that goes with that. Short cycle times, small increments, but fundamentally, the principle is we want to be working from releasable software. Now that gets interesting when you're building an Angular application or a React application or a Backbone application in the front end, and someone else is working on the server and getting all that synchronized. If you don't think it through, then you're going to run into lots of challenges. And this becomes especially true early in the project. And we're going to talk a little bit about how this changes over the life cycle of a project. So, we have an API front-end mismatch. The API isn't done. The API is late. Sorry. The API is late, the API is broken, it's just on a different time frame, and that causes challenges. And so what we want to do is essentially cross the chasm and have stories that work across REST APIs. And so some of the challenges are defining done, coordinating work, releasing work, and changing anything that breaks something somewhere becomes sort of fundamental to what's going on, because the server and the front end aren't that synchronized. You want to ensure quality, and different projects have different needs. And why do we need to fix this? And I'm going to pass this over to David to go through the next portion.
Thanks, Nick. Well, as everybody hopefully is aware, one of the key things about Agile is you want to release working software. Hopefully you're doing that every iteration, and hopefully your iterations are short. But the end result is software isn't providing any value unless it's not released. So that's the very first thing we always try to strive for. When you have different front and back end teams or different groups, or if you're, with our case, we often are doing the front end work here and have clients that are doing back end work, you often have different iterations and different cadences. And if you're not communicating to each other or being very clear around what's happening there, you can break your communication. And communicating constantly is a very core tenet of Agile. And without that communication, you can quickly get into trouble. One of the things we really believe in is short cycle times. So when you start a user story to when you deliver it to be accepted, we'd like to have that less than 3 days. But those short cycle times mean that you can have really lightweight processes, and you can deliver very often and get feedback really often. So what it all boils down to is that without real incremental releases, there's only the appearance of Agile, but you're not truly being Agile as you're not delivering. And one of the things that is also critical is surfacing problems. So one of the great things about Agile is, because you do deliver software and you get feedback really early, you can surface problems fast and have discussions early and resolve them and come to an agreement without rancor or issue, and move forward from there. So how do we fix this? So the very first thing is user stories. So I'll kind of go through the format of a user story. I think most people might have seen this before, but user stories are the basic unit of work that we do with our agile process. And so I'm just going to kind of talk about how the format of a user story can be really important to delivering the work really quickly and well. So there's kind of three key parts to a user story, and each one has its own value. So the very first thing is we like to say as a clearly defined role. So the clearly defined role is a persona or somebody who's using the product. Quite often in many projects you'll hear as a user, but we find as a user is very generic and doesn't tell you who it is. But if you say you're an anonymous customer or you're an inventory expert, then that can really help give a lot of context to the story. The next piece of user stories that are really important, of course, is actually describing what it is we're delivering. So as you describe the feature, you want to make sure you're explaining something that brings business value or learning value. It's not typically technical in nature, so it's definitely from the business side. And the last piece is really important to us, and that's the so that statement. We really want to make sure that we're sharing a context of the problem. And what this does is it gives the Scrum team the ability to think about what's being asked for, and not just to think about how to deliver it, but potentially even offer back to the product owner other options or potentially a different solution. So what's really important to us is that everybody understands what's trying to be fixed, or what the issue or problem might be, or what the want is, and the context around that, so that you have that full context around the story. And when you bring all these three things together, you have the role and then what's needed and the context around it. The whole team shares that understanding of that context. And then you're going to have high quality, and you're going to deliver something close to what's envisioned and move forward. So there's a number of things that make user stories good, and I'm going to walk through a couple of them now. But as I mentioned before, user story is the basic unit of work. So story writing is a bit of an art form as well as a science, and it needs to be practiced and looked at. And but there's certain things that are really important to think about every time. So that format I mentioned in the previous slide, you want to have that very clear description with a real context, and not something that is generic or too obvious. The next thing is acceptance criteria. So user stories themselves aren't really described in the Scrum guide, but for us at Rangle, we typically list some acceptance criteria with a story. And we don't try to write a book or go into every single nuance or detail, because we like to have our conversations. But acceptance criteria gives you a bit of formatting and a bit of understanding and ability to kind of organize your thoughts about what it is that the story is asking for. It can be in terms of a bit of workflow or error messages or data definition, whatever it may be. But having that kind of clear acceptance criteria gives you some assistance in working with the story. And the last thing is we like to have our stories as small as possible. So, as Nick mentioned earlier, the cycle time is really important. So at Rangle, we aim to have all our user stories done in 3 days or less. And what we find is when we have our average cycle time on projects below 3 days, we end up with a really good flow of stories happening every iteration. And our iterations tend to be 1 week in length. But what's critical is that while you go very small, it's still important that you have shippable software with that story and that you're done. And so it's important to maintain that vertical slice so that you're maintaining a true business function that's end-to-end and working, and not getting too horizontal or losing the context of that business value of that story. So another really important concept is story splitting, and especially with SPAs and having front end and back end, there's a lot of discussion over whether do you keep front end and back end stories separate, do you do them in a single story, and how do you manage that? And so one of the questions that ends up happening is, well, you have a front end piece, it's done, but the back end isn't. What's the story state? So if you have a single story, you're not done. It needs to be full stack. If you have a single story, multiple developers doing different cross-functional roles, the Scrum team itself needs to work together to get that story done within the sprint. So hopefully the team can jump on it and finish it and get it done. But until the full piece is completed, the story isn't done, even though you might be able to potentially demonstrate some front-end work. So if you do have two teams, what do you do? Do you do two stories? Do you have two boards? For us, we tend to have a single board unless a client has a back-end team that we work with. But for the most part, we keep a single story and we do the full stack. In the cases where the client does have a separate team, we try to work with them with their Agile and share our cadence and try to deliver the stories at the same time. And we'll use a Scrum meeting where it's like a stand up for your Scrum team, but just with the team leads, product owners, and Scrum masters of those two teams. So by doing that, we can kind of manage sprint goals together and aim for API delivery together. So at that point, the definition of done has to encompass both teams. And it's really important that you work together and both deliver and do a bit of integration testing and confirmation as part of that definition of done. And the big question, of course, is can you ship? So, if you have a front end and back end, whether they're separate teams, a client or a project team or whomever it may be, if you only deliver one of the two and you don't have shippable software, you're not done. So it's really critical to understand that and work through that. So the key for us is the software should be demonstratable, and you make decisions to emphasize shipping the software and having working software. Essentially, if you are doing sprint planning and you're looking at two teams and one team says we can't deliver this or the story is too big or we're missing context, and you don't bring in those stories to either team's board for that sprint planning, and you delay a sprint so you can solve those issues and both teams can do the stories at the same time. So with splitting stories, you can go too big or too small, and there's issues with either. It is a bit of an art, and a lot of this will happen over a number of iterations as the team grows together, learns about how they're working together, and gets better. But if you go too small, what ends up happening is the team loses a lot of context. So you tend to be very horizontal rather than vertical, and you end up losing the context of the business value of what you're delivering. Then often what happens, and this happens on the back end a lot, is you end up building something that's too big or too complex, delivers too much, and it takes a long time. And then often you've impacted quality because you've built so much work that hasn't been thought about and agreed and understood as a group. You end up with issues. And of course, you end up creating waste because as you move forward and change happens and you demonstrate the software, you might have built too much and a number of features or items might not get used. If you end up with stories that are too big, you end up getting blocked often. You're trying to do too much work at once, and you end up creating problems with communication and flow. So you tend to grow exponentially in size. So as you get to stories that take longer than 3 days, you end up quickly having stories that won't finish in the 1 week iterations that we do. Then as soon as you do that, you're pushing the next iteration out. You're creating a lot of anxiety and issues with the team. And so your communication starts to falter, your flow falters, and you end up stuck a lot, and your velocity drops, and your effectiveness and productivity drops. That's essentially what this third point says. So it gets exponential. So if the story, if you're using kind of points, you say a 3-point story is essentially what gets you a 3-day cycle time. If you start hitting 5-point stories, then you're going to find that takes over the week. If you have an 8-point story, it's going to take you 2 weeks. And it'll keep growing like that. So it ends up very problematic. But there's no hard and fast rule. It's just as the team, as you do your relative sizing and your planning poker or whatever method of estimation you might have, you just get a feel for relative sizing of the stories, and you'll get better at writing the stories and knowing when to split and then what is too big and too small. So the next section we want to talk about is the API contracts. And API contracts are the means of getting agreement between the front end and the back end team, whether they're in the same company or whether it's across companies, depending how you run your projects or build your products. So the way to manage APIs is to document the API. The API is a contract that's agreed to by both sides. So even if you're building kind of asynchronously, as long as you're building to that contract, then you have some guarantee that the API will work. So that'll allow a front end team possibly to move ahead and provide mock data or mock up the API itself or create a pseudo API that will deliver the same data definition, the same methods, the same fields as the true API when it comes. And then the API itself can come a little bit later, perhaps, and that might be a way forward. to do this. So, but the key is that it is an agreement between both sides. So even if one team ostensibly owns the API, then there's still a responsibility for that team to get agreement and to publish changes to the contract. So it doesn't have to be a big formal detailed document. It could just be an actual endpoint that's discoverable, and that if you've actually built that, or it could be a shared WSDL file or something equivalent to that, JSON file, or it could just be a quick document or just a short, even verbal description if it's a very straightforward API. But managing that contract is really critical. So as I mentioned before, you can be asynchronous with the delivery through the contract. So the mocking the data allows the front end to move forward ahead of time if the API is going to be a bit late. And as Nick mentioned, one of the big problems that happens a lot is the APIs are late. They're understated. If you're working with an enterprise system or a larger client, challenges arise. Sometimes the delivery cycles are longer. There's more overhead in getting APIs delivered. Sometimes it's just connectivity and integration to the API and setting up SSL or getting key setups, server setups, that sort of thing. So on the front end side with the SPA, you want to be able to move forward on certain stories. Then this contract lets you move forward with mocking with a bit of confidence that when the API is delivered, you can integrate to it and maybe not be perfect, but have minimal roadblocks and minimal issues when you deliver. So continuous delivery. I'm going to hand back over to Nick for this one.
Thanks, Nick. So some of the questions that come up when you talk about story size, like sometimes you're building out the front end and you don't know what you want to build yet, so you're doing a clickable prototype. And what does it really mean in that case? What's done and is it shippable? Is that story done? And then as you get further into a project, you're building out features, but those features can't be complete yet because there's not enough infrastructure. And this does change the dynamic of what's done at each phase of the project. And to confuse the process because of rules that you're trying to follow early in a project versus late in a project is one of the major dysfunctions of trying to have a true agile process with a single page app or really any type of app. And so a great way to think about it is what is your shippability at any particular phase and know what kind of adjustments that you're going to make. So when you start off a project, one of the best things you can do is a clickable prototype. You're defining features, you're actually implementing a solution, and your goal is really learning. So the goal is not the end feature. So the goal, that context is important. And also, is it going to be the final shippable thing? So you might say your shippability is 10%. It's a clickable prototype. You can show it to users, but it's not going to be in production for a long period of time. So the concept of done is quite flexible because done is really the feedback, and anything that gets you that feedback, that's done. Now you move further into your project and you start building out features, but your back end isn't there yet, and you can't be rolling out APIs yet because you may be working on some of the infrastructure, some of the back end connectivity. There may be some things that are slowing down the back end. You can't synchronize it. That's ideal later in the project, but if you try to make it happen early in the project, then you're going to have all kinds of drag on your progress and your cycle time because you're going to have teams waiting on teams and having long discussions, and you're just going to keep spinning your wheels. And you're not going to get the feedback, right? So you want to get features built. You can build them with mock data. You're getting feedback from users. So you're really, your shippability at that point is, say, 30%. And if you understand that and you're using that to manage your process, done is less flexible now. It's conceivable that you want to say that the feature is with mock data, but when the API is connected, it should work or almost work, or there might be a little bit of tweaking. So done is less flexible. Then once you get, say, a third of the way through the project, this is where you really have your done is ramping up. You can almost think of it as done debt. Like early on, you accumulate that because you have to do some testing, scalability testing. You have to do some extra tweaking and rework early features because you didn't have everything there to make it done. So that's that debt. But when you get to a solid, releasable piece of software, running software, and you're working from that, that's when you really want to get your definition of done really locked down. So your features are delivered live, your back end matches the front end, your shippability is 80%. which means that most of the time you can build a feature and deliver it. Sometimes you'll still have a little bit of the, the back end needs a little bit of extra work. You want to actually test something, so you're going to mock out a little bit. But most of the time you're getting your features delivered done in that sprint. And then finally, you have software that works, and you should consider it in production. If you really want to have a great agile process and move into continuous delivery, if you can consider your software to be live and shipped at, say, your 60% point, or even earlier, 50% in a bigger project, now you're just incrementally releasing features against it. And that's the best state you can be in, because you know exactly where you're at. You can get feedback, you can get ROI by actually having value delivered. And so asking yourself, what's my shippability at this phase? What's the goal of delivery? And what kind of debt are we going to incur? And this gives, I think, a pretty good roadmap for that. So I would say that this encompasses most of what I think that we've learned over time in the discussions in the different projects. And if you do track to this and you evolve your process as you get further through a project lifecycle, it makes a world of difference. One of the things with continuous delivery, it's about feedback, it's about frequency. I like this chart because this sort of follows my career, where I started working in companies that didn't have version control, and then they introduced it. And then use cases, which were about delivering units of value. Use cases, when they were first delivered, was about initially breaking down requirements from a common point of view, but also releasing that unit of value. And that was iterative development, incremental development, unit testing, things that would speed up feedback. Agile, Scrum, so now you're taking your documentation and making it much more incremental. Continuous integration, DevOps to automate the deployments, continuous deployment, continuous delivery. So that's an increasing sort of adoption of pervasive feedback in projects. And continuous delivery is one of the best ways of doing that, because that means that you've wired up everything end to end. That sort of takes everything here and wraps it up together. So, continuous what? There's some confusion about what that actually means. Continuous integration is where it started. It moved into continuous delivery, continuous deployment. So continuous integration, you build multiple times per day after every merge. You're getting feedback all the time. It's supposed to be done, releasable, but not perfectly, right? This is a partial step. You're automating everything. You're linking it together. And you want to keep things clean and working. Continuous delivery, you're producing value at frequent intervals. Now you're really getting into agile delivery. You keep master deployable. Continuous deployment, you're actually deploying the code. It can be tricky on the back end, easy for the front end. They're all related. It's not really the point of this talk, but I put in a few slides there. The key thing is this slide, the overlap between continuous delivery and agile or Scrum. What continuous delivery does is it actually keeps you honest. You're not incurring debt. If you can't deliver shippable software, it's a broken process. That's fundamentally the bottom line, which means that if you can't automate it, it's a broken process. Because if you're maintaining shippable software, you should be able to automate that deployment pipeline. And so we found that continuous delivery is fundamentally a critical part of having an effective Scrum or Agile process, because it highlights all of the issues. Things break quickly because you're actually trying to do it and you're trying to automate it. So that's a bit on continuous delivery and how that overlaps with the process and the sort of shifts in thinking that you go through. And to summarize that concept of how shippable are you at that particular point in your project for your goals at that point in the project. And so with that, I'm going to hand it back to David.
All right, thanks, Nick. So when you start doing continuous deployment and you automate a lot, there often is a question then about with Agile testing, how do you test? We talk about automated testing, but we actually have quality analysts and testers at Rangle, and what is their role and how do you ensure quality for your SPA project? And so the answer for us, it's been an evolution, but what we really want to stress with our quality analysts is that they're involved at every level of the project. Quality is pervasive throughout the project, and we don't just want to think about a set of tests after the code is built. So what's really been interesting and helpful for us and is that we have our quality analysts and our testers work with the product owner and with the whole team as well, but to help define acceptance criteria for stories. Often it's explicit, but often it's also implicit, especially if you have a co-located agile team where you're not running a lot of details in your acceptance criteria. But by having the quality analyst spend time with the product owner and think about the testing of the product at that point, then that can shape and influence the acceptance criteria. And the other thing that happens in parallel with that is when a user story is actually started with a developer, we like to have the tester and the developer talk to each other at that point and talk about what unit tests might be automated, what end-to-end tests might be automated, how the API tests might be automated, potential test cases and test strategies that the tester might think about, and then share the context of the story itself with them. And by doing that, we end up with a really good conversation and a lot of talk before the work begins. And by that, sharing that context to a deeper level, what happens, the developer will build very, very good, high quality code, and which is key for us because we do have the process where we have the continuous deployment, whether it's staging or production, and we don't actually test our user stories until after they're in front of our clients. So we want to try and get commitment from everybody up front and that quality up front as much as possible. The other point that we really like is that we do pair programming when we can, but we also do pair testing. And sometimes it could be two testers, but more often than not, it's a developer and a tester together. And so sometimes it's the same developer who built the story, other times it's not. But we'll sit down together and talk it through and do the testing together. And then we'll be able to do final acceptance on that user story. But again, at that point, it's already in staging or potentially already in production. So it's just almost a bit of a second chance to catch anything fairly quickly after it's delivered. So what's critical about this is that the whole project has an aura of quality with it, and quality is part of your definition of done and part of your team norms. And while you have a person on the team whose primary skill set might be quality analyst or tester, everybody has a role and a piece of that, and you're discussing it as part of the conversation as early as possible. So the other thing that's really interesting we found with our quality analysts in an agile shop, especially doing the type of work we do with mobile apps and websites, is we have quality analysts with all sorts of skill sets, and so we can put people on different projects based on these skill sets and the needs of the project. But by having different people with different skills, kind of primary or secondary skills around different testing, we get a lot of value. So we find that sure, you can do manual testing, but by having somebody who's an expert in performance tests or who can help build and execute automated testing, whether it's EDE or API tests, or whether they can do discoverability and testing against UI UX, or sometimes even if they're technical enough, we have folks who can read code, who can do minor bug fixing. So it's very powerful when somebody who's ostensibly a tester sees a short little defect, maybe it's a spelling mistake even, or maybe it's a drop semicolon or something very trivial, they can actually go into the code, do the quick fix themselves, merge the PR, and then retest, and we're good. And that kind of gives you a lot of speed and flexibility and power. DevOps is something one or two of our testers are able to do as well, which takes some of the load off some of the dev team when we start off the project and we're building out our Circle CI or various environments. So the key thing that comes from this, from the previous slide for us, is that manual testing at the end is probably the least important part of quality. And it's critical that for the whole SPA project that we're thinking about testing as a team, and we're acting and thinking about quality all the way through the process. And then we're on to adjust as needed, and back to Nick.
Thanks, David. Yeah, so one of the key things I think in any complex endeavor is that the answer to what should I do is really it depends. And when you're building a project, there's so many factors. So one of the problems with any kind of software development process is cargo cult sort of process where people are just following it and expecting it to work. So faux scrum, scrum or fall, however you want to call it, where you're basically going through the motions and not really getting to the essence of it. So We talked about, the different aspects of having an effective Scrum or Agile process for single-page applications, but there are other things that will factor in. So every project is different, adjust as needed. So, one of the most wonderful things that might happen is you already have the API and it's awesome and it exists and it's perfect for your application. That changes things significantly. So your concept of shippability and how early you can do that in your project shoots way up. It also reduces the amount of effort you would need and the amount of sharing of information among team members because you're not building the back end and the front end at the same time. You may have that the API is ultimately going to be delivered on a vastly different time scale. Now, this could be because of resourcing, this could be because of research, this could be, and you still want the front end because the front end is going to be as you expect it, and you can build it and you can get feedback, and it's meaningful to do that. So your definition of done is going to shift, and you're going to stick with the shippability as being like 30–40%. And maybe at the end you're going to wire it up and it's all going to work, but the chances are when you do that wiring at the end that there's going to be a fair bit of effort to figure out what some of the issues are, and that's where the API contract really comes into play that David talked about. You can resolve a lot of those issues by really nailing that down. So documentation is great. I mean, you sort of think, well, Agile means you don't need documentation, but the Agile Manifesto is, it's people over process, and documentation is still important, but we prefer to not use it if we don't need it because it can get in the way. But if you're building a single-page app and you have an API that needs to be implemented by a different team, that's going to happen at a later time. Documentation is essential. So that API contract. Again, the goal, we talked about this, the goal of the development process is user feedback, and it's largely prototype driven. So you want to build a lot of your application because you want to prototype it, you want to get feedback, and you may even have the expectation that the code is going to be thrown away. So this drives changes. There's no need to get really obsessive about your concept or your definition of done if it doesn't really matter, because you're really looking for that feedback, and that's your goal. So, but if you really do want to get into production and you want to build a production app and you want to ship it, you want to get to that definition of done that is releasable code, and that you do have that sort of synchronization between your front end and your back end once you get to that stable sort of platform state, partway through your process. There's some other sort of interesting considerations. So, your single page applications, your user experience. So, when you're building applications, user experience is quite interesting. If you do have a big user experience challenge, you do want to get users using it. You want to see how they work. You may build out more than expected. So that's getting into that prototype sort of consideration. The challenge is, without live data, without actually users really using an application, it's really hard to get the right feedback. So you want to get enough feedback to go off in the right direction. You don't want to do a deep user experience design project and then build the whole thing. We're proponents of a lean UX process where we keep the design work in line with the development work. So we'll do user experience work for a week or two, depending upon what the goals are, and then we will define and build features and get the feedback and keep moving through the process, having that integrated user experience work. The problem otherwise is that you do end up slipping into a waterfall sort of type process because the UX is all being done up front. And then you have this horrible situation where you're partway through a project and there's a real issue with some of the design work, but none of the context is available to the team. So they're lost. They have to believe that there was some meaningful conversation several months ago where these requirements and these designs were come up with, but those people aren't available anymore. The people, it's a mess, and it really limits the team's ability to actually think and solve problems. So that's where that definition of done and being able to deliver within a sprint should incorporate a lot of the UX work as well, because that is an important part of the process. When you're building applications, different developers are working on different features that touch different parts of your single page app. So one is controllers. So these normally work against services that may be mocked. They're likely to be easier to complete without back-end support, because they are abstracted from the back end. If needed, you can consider the story done if it's conceivable that only a service change is needed. This depends largely on what shippability phase you're in. So early on, you'll have lots of work being done against mock services, and you're just going to drive yourself nuts not considering those to be done. You just have no way to measure cycle time. You've got no meaningful process feedback. The whole idea of having an agile process and Scrum or whatever it is that it's meaningful and gives you meaningful feedback. If you find yourself making decisions that stop you from getting meaningful feedback, you're doing something wrong. So leaving stories open until the back end's done 12 weeks later is frankly ridiculous, and it's going to completely destroy your process. So that's where thinking about that shippability is important. Now, if you always have that situation where the back end is going to be done 12 weeks later, you've got another problem. And at some point in your process, those need to get aligned. And it's got to happen really early in your process, ideally before your project's halfway over, or you're just going to run into some madness at the back end of the project and you won't have any predictability. So that's controllers. Services and single page applications. They connect to the back end, they complete the feature slice from the single page app to the back end, but they also encapsulate mock data for the user feature development. So you might have a service that's built up to provide the rough data for the features being built in the prototype, and then they're going to sit there until the back end is completed and ready for integration. So this may introduce some interesting ways of talking about the stories. This is where dysfunction in using your tools comes into play. People like to count points, and they like to see visibility to their own work. And people start splitting stories simply to serve that bookkeeping, accounting need, as opposed to actually running an effective process. So if you're doing a prototype front-end feature and you've got a story, and someone has to write a little back-end service stuff, let them write the little back-end service stuff, finish the story, complete it, consider it done, and that's that. That service is going to be worked on again later as part of a different story potentially, or as part of there's going to be other things that are going to drive that completion in the future. You don't want to overcomplicate things, and that's where where are we in our shippability? What are we trying to measure? And you make that decision, and you consider that story to be done without getting bent out of shape over it. This is where post-it notes are lovely, because you just can't get too complicated using post-it notes. When you're using tools that allow you to assign and break down and add tasks and assign people and report on it, this is where you actually make this more complicated than it actually needs to be. What's the story? What's the user story? What's the value you're delivering? It is a prototype. It's a feature that's using mock data. That's the story. That's the value. It doesn't matter if there's 2, 3, or 4 people working on it. It's a team-based process. Components in single page applications. This is really exciting, and this is really coming to fruition in the last year with React, Angular, web components, and really building high-level components that are independent, modular, and composable. So you're really breaking down your application into these composable units, and we're coming up with the architectures and the practices for doing this, and that impacts, again, how you might go about building them. I'd say there's new opportunities here for delivering small pieces of functionality. We're still really learning, some of the unique nuances here. But with reactive models, the back end is more abstracted from the front end, and that does enable somewhat of a different definition of done that is based more on the data stream rather than the implementation. Your front end is actually being defined against a more abstract sort of back end, which is very powerful. This is still a new area. It should evolve quickly. Would have liked to have a little more sort of thinking and some lessons learned from some of our projects extracted for this, but I'd say we'll cover that probably in another webinar in a couple of months. And so with that, we're going to move over to conclusions. And I'll leave this with David and just pipe in as.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, so as we mentioned, single page applications, we're working with APIs, and the APIs, especially if you're working with clients or large enterprise, medium-sized companies, pretty anybody. Actually, we have internal projects where we build APIs for each other from node servers. Those APIs can often be late or have issues or whatever. So we use contracts, which is just some kind of written agreement, very simple. between the two teams, saying what is the API going to be composed of, what are the methods, what's the data, perhaps even basic edits. And that drives the communication between the two teams or within the team on what the API is going to be about, and then you can go ahead and do the early shippability phases with confidence that when the API is delivered, you can integrate to it with minimal amount of risk and hiccups. So we like to always stay focused on releasable software, 1 week iterations. The user stories that you do should be workable software, releasable software, and you should be meeting your definition of done every time. Stories should not hang around. As Nick coined it, we should not have done debt, where you have stories that are waiting on APIs or testing or whatever, multiple iterations down the road. Things get done and they get delivered. So you always understand context and where you are. So, you want to adjust what you're trying to deliver. You want to understand what the needs of the project are. You want to discover, you want to get your feedback. The feedback's critical to everything. And so don't be afraid to adjust the definition of done each time. We have retrospectives every week and with the product owners. So that's a good opportunity to readjust what you're doing, what it means to be done as you get closer and closer to production. If you're doing continuous deployment into production, then your done is really, really important. If you're doing just a basic mock app with some basic UI to demonstrate to a potential client for a sale, then it can be much simpler. But essentially, as you go and as you are impacting production, your definition done should be very strong, and you should have a very, very high quality around that.
All right, so thanks everyone for attending.